Back at it again with the Mobius Dickus, Chapter 54, The Town Hose Story. So this is an odd one, right? It's long. It doesn't seem particularly figurative. I didn't highlight any passages through my entire reading of this chapter, and it's substantial. That's odd, man. And certainly I think it's a challenging chapter that obviously revolves around the dynamic between Steelkilt and Radney. And it's a weird kind of plot-driven interaction about their feud with each other and the truth of the storytelling at the end. I think if I'm going to say anything about this chapter, it has to come down to how we interpret the appearance of Moby Dick in the story, right? Because that's pretty much, in my opinion, the only way this gets tied into the whole story is like, hey, there's this conflict between two random sailors, and like they're et cetera, and here's how Moby Dick comes into it. And I think that this is a chapter which is purposefully vague in its role as, an instructive or teaching chapter, and I think it all kind of swings on the axis of how do you see the presence of Moby Dick in the story. So obviously Moby Dick eats Radney when they're out at sea in a kind of brutal way, right? It says like his bloody shirt is found, they see it in his jaws. It's kind of crazy, right? So I think if we see Steelkit as the protagonist here, as him being maliciously and unfairly treated by Radney, who has some weird pride, who takes things too seriously, and that we feel that Steelkit is like a justified rebel, then perhaps Moby Dick is like the vengeance of God evening out the score between Steelkit and Radney. He's a sign that Radney overplayed his hand cosmically, and that Kilt deserved to be the victor here. You could also interpret it the other way. You could say, well, if Steelkilt is actually in the wrong, and he is simply being a total ass and is, totally out of line, and Radney is the one who was in the right in the first place, and then Steelkilt goes even further and commits this mutiny, maybe Moby Dick is this kind of nefarious evil force that is siding with the wrongdoer here, that is compounding the arbitrariness and capriciousness of the Radney Steelkilt situation. And then, of course, we have the third option, which is that Moby Dick is just a whale, and it just so happens that Radney happened to want to get on the whale's back, and it just so happened that he gets eaten by Moby Dick. So I think the Town Hose story, is another way that Melville is exploring this question of how do you see and how do you interpret and how do you know the nature of human events in the world. Are they full of meaning? Is the conclusion of the story something that retroactively changes the nature of the previous events? Or is the conclusion of the story an act of random chance that is empty of any kind of resolution or conclusion about the moral ambiguity of the relationship between Radney and Steelkilt? I think it's unclear. And ultimately, this is a chapter which seems divorced in many ways from the previous chapters and challenging in terms of its implications for the rest of the book. So we'll leave it there, and I'll see you in chapter 55.